All right, are you ready to get started?
Yeah.
All right, welcome to Dear Editor. This is an educational series from the Research Medical Library where we discuss topics on scientific writing and publishing. Um, I am Larissa Gann from the Research Medical Library. Today, our presenter is going to be our senior scientific editor, Joe Munch. If you haven't used the services of the scientific editors, you really should check it out on our website. They do amazing work and they're just really wonderful. So reach out and ask questions if you have questions. But today we're going to ask the question, how do I write an effective title for my research paper? So let me just do a little poll as kind of an icebreaker. So the question that I'm asking, can you see the poll okay, Joe?
hmm
Okay. So which of the following article titles are not real? And I don't know if you can actually see the full article title unless you expand the poll a little bit for yourself. And this is just for fun. There's no grading. No judgment.
I don't know if it's real or not, but clean up on aisle 6. Whoever wrote that deserves a little prize
If they gave prizes for article titles.
somewhere, someplace.
Maybe we should start doing that just for MD Anderson staff. All right. I'm gonna, couple people still voting here. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. See if I can share the results of what y'all voted for. This was a trick question. These are all real article titles. I was able to find them all either in PubMed or in a professional journal, academic journal. When I saw the COVID-19 cleanup on aisle 6, I laughed out loud. I don't, it was just funny to me. So there is a tradition of sometimes creating these humorous titles. But what I did find when I was doing research on this, like, is it good to create a funny title? Is it not good? These tend to be shorter, less important papers that people use sort of silly titles on. For instance, in Nature, when they use like a joke headline, they're doing it for like a news article or something to get some views and some clicks. It's not usually for maybe your most important paper ever. So I just thought that was kind of fun that they had some pretty good time. There were way more than this, by the way, if you're interested in digging into the internet and seeing some funny journal article titles. So Joe, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so silly titles definitely have their place. But that place typically isn't for research articles or even review articles. They're typically, as Larissa said, they're kind of like the I wouldn't call them clickbaity, but they're kind of the articles that are going to be kind of fun anyway. So let's just move into kind of why titles are so important. And titles are important because they're really the ultimate distillation of your research paper, right? So if you have your overall research paper, a kind of like a first level distillation of that might be the abstract, where you summarize your findings and methods and why they're important. The title is almost a further distillation of that abstract. So your title for whatever paper you're writing needs to kind of convey the key idea of your paper. And so a good title is going to summarize the essence of your article one way or the other. It might give just what the article is about, or it might even give conclusions, but it's going to give anybody reading that title a pretty clear idea of what they're going to find in the article. And along those lines, it persuades readers to actually read your article, because your title is going to be the first thing that many people see when they do a PubMed search, or if it's shared on social media or any of those other avenues. a good title is going to pique readers' interest, and hopefully pique the interest of readers whom you want to read your paper. It also distinguishes your study from others in the field, and that's increasingly difficult to do because so much of even what is specialized, those titles can kind of run together in people's minds. So this is kind of the big challenge of writing a good title, is to make it one that distinguishes your study from others. So the things that make a good title are basically this set of factors here. It should name the factors studied. So whether it was a certain disease or a certain protein or gene, or if you looked at a certain method to use something, whatever the main factors are, should make an appearance in the title. It should also include the population, and that could be the animal, the plant, the cell line, whatever was studied. For clinical studies, you should name the kind of study that was done, because a lot of information can be relayed by, for example, a randomized phase 2 trial, because that's going to give readers a very clear idea of the kind of study you did. And especially when it comes to folks who are doing reviews or meta-analyses, they're looking for those kinds of studies to include in those analyses. That's why it's important to include the clinical trial, kind of the name that indicates the design of that trial, in those kinds of titles. You can also consider stating your main study's findings. So much of this is dependent on the journal you're submitting to, however, because certain journals, I mean, it runs the gamut from just give us an idea of what you studied, to give us your specific conclusions, to give us this, this, and this, but don't give us this. So whenever you're submitting to a particular journal, be sure to check those author guidelines to make sure your title kind of falls in line with what they're looking for. But in general, these are the things that make a good title.
Yeah, and Joe, I was thinking as we were kind of planning for this, that like your title is sort of the billboard for your article, right? And as a librarian, we are often watching people's searching behaviors, like how you search PubMed, and your title really makes a difference in how people are going to actually search PubMed and actually find your article. So it's just something to keep in mind too.
Absolutely. And so along those lines, let's take a quick look at a couple titles here. Just let us know in the chat box, one or two, which of these is the more effective title. And we have a couple votes for one. Okay, it looks like we have universal voting for one. And I would say you're right, all of you who chose one. The first title is pretty specific, right? So you get a really clear picture of what that paper is about. Whereas the second title is more general. Expression of retinoic acid receptors in cancer might be the title of a very big review article, but in terms of looking for a specialized article on, say, the methylation and regulation of these retinoic acid receptor beta isoforms, that first title really conveys all the information a reader will need to decide whether they're going to delve into that article. And along these lines, as you're composing your title, and we'll talk a little bit more about strategies in a bit, but how many of those words in the first title could actually also be keywords for that article, for indexing purposes in PubMed or whatever? So as you're writing your title, take a look at those keywords you're coming up with and see if you can wedge a few of those in your title. It usually is a pretty good strategy for conveying all the main ideas, but also, as Larissa mentioned, if your title is going to be the billboard for your article, those keywords are going to help make it pop on searches. So there's many things to avoid in writing a good title. You should always avoid using questions for titles, especially for research articles. So presumably your research article would answer the question that the title is asking. So why don't you just give the answer? Avoid using abbreviations or acronyms, because a title that is, that kind of alphabet soup can be utterly confusing to some people, especially if they're not familiar with your line of research. Now, of course, there's exceptions. If, for example, you're looking into MRI and you're publishing in a journal that is about imaging or imaging physics or something related, usually it's going to be okay to use MRI in the title. But again, it just depends on the journal. There's some acceptable abbreviations that journals have, and there's some not so acceptable abbreviations. If you're going to write the conclusion or kind of give a title that states your main findings, you should definitely avoid overinterpreting the significance of your findings, because that can really, it just kind of give a distorted view of what's in the paper. Just some basic good advice for just about anything title-wise is you should avoid super long titles and you should avoid super short titles, because one can bury the reader and the other might not be as informative. Now, again, different journals are going to have different length limits for their titles. Some journals require very short titles. Other journals allow up to 3 lines of text. It just depends. But in general, you want to hit kind of that sweet spot between too long and too short, where it's informative, but won't bury your readers in too much detail. Finally, with the exception of those clinical studies where you're talking about doing a randomized phase 2 trial or whatever, you should avoid these uninformative phrases, a study of, a report of, the role of. If it's being published as an original article, people will probably guess that it's a study of something, or that this is a report of some findings. Similarly, the treatment of, if it's an article about an agent that's going to be used to treat this or that cancer, a treatment of isn't going to add too much to readers' understanding. So avoid those uninformative phrases, and in part because when you do have those length limitations that various journals impose, you want to make all those words count. So putting something like the role of in your title isn't going to really serve that purpose.
And Joe, you and I also talked about the other day, one that I've noticed recently that a lot of people use as a lead-in for articles is the word targeting. It seems like a trendy word to use. So if somebody doesn't know what other word to use, like what's a good option for looking for alternative keywords or title words?
Talk to an editor would be my first bit of advice. And targeting's a funny one because it does have a meaning, but some people tend to use it almost like they use the term leveraging, which also has a specific meaning, but also is misused often. So if you're finding yourself kind of falling into the trendy title, trap, I'm going to copyright that. Pause and think if there's a better way, a more precise way of conveying what you mean to say. Of course, editors can help with that. And if you send us our papers and we spot something that looks a little overly trendy or not as informative as it could be or imprecise, we'll flag it and help you out. So some things to avoid in title. And yes, Larissa just posted our email address here. So rml-editing@mdanderson.org. Okay, so here's another a couple of examples. So which of these is the more effective title? I think I saw 1-1, mostly 2s. I would say the 2s have it here, in part because the second title is much more detailed and it doesn't have that kind of the effects of, which is kind of just empty wording right there. And so in the first title, you have this kind of very general effects of concomitant cisplatin and radiotherapy, et cetera. And okay, readers may want to know what those effects are, but the second title actually gives that effect, or one of those effects, when it says improves rates of survival and control of local disease. Now, there are some, as I mentioned repeatedly, the different journals have different requirements for the titles that they're going to publish, right? So this first option might actually be a viable title for a certain journal that has, for example, a short word count, for a journal that doesn't want conclusions mentioned in the title itself. But on the whole, that second option is a much more specific, much more informative title. And that's what you should aim for. This one's a little different, and if you can spot the difference, go ahead and holler it out or put it in the chat box as to why one or the other works and the other does not. It looks like someone spotted the difference. Yep. Right. So that first one's actually the preferred, would be the preferred title, because as you're writing your title, and just in general, when you're writing about certain agents, you should use the generic and not the brand name term. Now, the exception is because the second one here, Cytoxan, is the brand name for cyclophosphamide. But the exception might be if you're actually comparing, if you're doing a study that compares two brand name versions of the generic, then you might include both the brand names in the title or a brand name in the title. But in general, you want to use the generic term when referring to agents. And that's true in the title, and it's true throughout your manuscript, really. So how to get started? I talked a bit about this earlier, and there's kind of there's two pretty solid strategies that you can kind of work with to come up with a decent title. One is to write down the main conclusion of your article. So a title like low molecular weight isoforms of cyclin E to regulate the cell cycle of mammary epithelial cells. You can kind of imagine how that phrase was just kind of pulled from a conclusion section in the manuscript, and it makes a pretty effective title. Another strategy is to, again, take those keywords or the words or terms that represent the most important aspect of your studies. So rabies eradicated in southern Belgium with recombinant vaccinia rabies vaccine. So you can see all these kind of keywords popping up in this title again: rabies, recombinant vaccinia rabies vaccine. I mean, those are all keywords, and they're all very important parts of that study. So it might not, you might have to rework some of those words into a certain order here and there, but in general, and again, working within the confines of what the journal dictates, you can write down that main conclusion and usually come up with a pretty good title, or you can start jotting down those keywords and also come up with a fairly good title. So a few other things to consider. Absolutely check the journal for format. Different journals have different expectations, different requirements, different guidelines. And if you're submitting to a journal, just be sure that your title, as well as the rest of your manuscript, kind of adheres to those guidelines. Running titles, just as a related note, running titles are those bits of text that you see way back in the day in printed journals that would run across the top of a page. And many journals ask for these running titles that they would include on the pages on which the article actually appears. Most journals ask for them. Many have specific instructions for them. They tend to be shorter than regular titles, but that's a running title. And a running title, like your main title, should probably reflect the main players in your study. You should also aim for consistency. So when you're submitting that manuscript, plus a cover letter, plus whatever other correspondence to the journal, you need to make sure that whatever title you're using is consistently worded throughout. So the same title should appear on the manuscript cover page, should appear on the title page, should appear in your email, whatever it is. One thing that's kind of determined by the journal you're submitting to, but should have in mind whenever you're writing, including your title, is to consider your audience. Because if you're writing for a broader audience, or if you're writing for a journal with a broader audience, say if you're looking to submit to Science or Nature or one of those very broad-based journals, you need to think about what their level of knowledge and understanding is. So you want to avoid things like jargon, and you want to avoid using acronyms that might not be familiar to that readership. And then Larissa, you might be able to talk a little bit more about making sure your title is searchable in databases like PubMed.
Yeah, this is interesting to me because a lot of you come to the library for literature searches, and everyone is used to using Google, right? And you type in keywords and you expect the answer to come up. But PubMed, the type of literature you guys are looking for, it's often more complex because of these types of titles, keywords, terms that you're using. So something that you should consider is try searching PubMed when you're selecting a title for your topic. Use the keywords you would use normally. See what kinds of titles are coming up, if there's a pattern to those keywords. PubMed uses something called best match, which means search results are frequently returned based on those titles. So you want to pick popular keywords that are current, that will be retrieved when you search in PubMed. Yeah, so it's just something to think about, is how is someone going to actually find your article? Because you've worked so hard on it, you want it to actually be out there and accessible and findable for people. And I can promise you there are things that are hard to find based on titles, abstracts, and keywords. So something to think about. And you can always ask the library too, and we can kind of do a little quick search for you and give you some recommendations as well. Does anyone have questions so far? Or thoughts on creating titles? I think, Joe, it's kind of hard to figure out, like, because we say not to make them too short, but not to make them too long. So how do you find the sweet spot on that? Or do you have any recommendations?
My best recommendation is, I think the best titles kind of give, as I mentioned, they give the essence of the article, and that's really what the conclusion is. This is the kernel of knowledge that this article contributes to, science. And so the best strategy, I think, is to write down that conclusion and then kind of whittle it or even expand it into a viable title, keeping that journal's, whatever journal it is, keeping the journal's instructions and length limitations in mind. And that, it's, what is that sweet spot between too long and too short? I mean, in general, I think it's better to err on the side of more information because you want an informative title and you want people to see the title, and we all make those snap decisions whether we're going to read something based on so little information. In that little 240 or whatever characters it is, and so it's important to get kind of really use that space effectively, and so that means actually packing a lot of information into that little space. So that's where I'd err for longer, and then if the journal allows it, and then if it comes back that it's too long, then whittle it down. But yeah, short titles tend not to be super helpful unless they're already in a journal like Nature or Science, because those journals, articles in those journals kind of sell themselves, which is a completely different discussion. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah,
We do have a.
I was just going to say, if I've learned anything I've learned a lot from working with our editors, but one of the things I've learned is to pull out the words that don't really have meaning when I'm writing. And it's something I have to be conscious of, to think about when I'm constructing a sentence or a title in this case. Like, there are words that you sometimes, add in that just aren't necessary. That don't actually help the topic or the title. So I appreciate learning that from you. There's a question in the chat now.
Yeah, and it looks
Um,
like someone raised their hand. We'll do the chat question first. And the question is adding humor material to the title a good idea? Well, in general, no. In part because when we're talking about doing original research, and especially in a field like cancer research, a humorous title can come off as being kind of flip. And that's not something you want to convey. You don't want to like convey this idea that you're not serious about your work. And so, especially for those original articles, review articles, even case reports, I just avoid it. There are some exceptions, of course. I mean, if you're writing a specific kind of editorial that kind of lends itself to humor, I can't think of a good example now, but if you're writing a commentary, an editorial, a letter to the editor, there are some kind of areas of a journal that kind of might be suited to some humor, but I'd be really careful because humor is so subjective. And as in kind of the sciences, there's a real value placed on being serious and being straightforward and having good communication. And so if you try to make a joke and it doesn't land, that could be really bad. And for anybody who's made a joke in a room full of people and have heard silence afterwards, I mean, just imagine that across like PubMed, people just kind of raising an eyebrow, like, what? So just in general, avoid humor. And if you do find the opportunity, I mean, go for it. Just please be careful.
Yeah, I think too, like culturally, sometimes we make jokes like pop culture jokes that everyone's not going to get. So the example that we showed, the fantastic yeasts and where to find them, not everybody's going to get that reference.
Right.
And especially like a few years from now, people are really not going to necessarily, well, Harry Potter fans will get it, but maybe, but it gets old at some point. So that's another thing to consider is you want this article to be, around a long time, and not everybody's going to get the joke. That one in particular, I noticed was in a themed issue on host microbe interactions. So perhaps the humor was more suited there because it was a themed issue, but still, I think in preparing for this, I was looking at some of the funny titles and I didn't get all of them. Now that could be because I don't have that specific background or because I just don't know that pop culture reference. So they don't all land like Joe said.
Right. And I mean, especially the pop culture stuff, just to reiterate, I mean, it's not just understanding those kinds of references doesn't just boil down to, your age, but also if you've got an international audience and people just aren't familiar with this or that aspect of, if you're an American writing in America and you have all these, we have all this great pop culture we can talk about, I don't know about right now, but you can't expect everybody to get those based on age, based on experience, based on cultural differences. It's like I said, comedy's hard. Drama's easy, comedy's hard. So avoid humor. Okay, we had another question. Someone had their hand up.
Yes. Any thoughts for creating a title for a article before you've gotten the results? Like say you're still in the proposal stage or like an IRB stage?
That's a good question. And it also kind of relates to this idea of, grants have to have titles too, right? And so much of, grant titles, I mean, they're different from article titles because grant titles aren't publicized on PubMed or anything, but they have to convey a main idea. So even if you don't have all the approvals online, or you haven't completed all your experiments, or you're only beginning to write up your results or whatever, you probably have a pretty good idea of what the key factors are that you're investigating. And based on those key factors, you should be able to, cobble together something that would work. And of course, after you have your results, it's much easier to come up with a title that might speak to the conclusion of the study or whatever. But if you're just kind of, you're kind of doing your writing as you're going along, or if you're proposing a grant and the grant needs a title, and grants are a great example here because by nature you don't know what you're going to find. You have a pretty good idea, but you don't know exactly. But you have to have a title that kind of encapsulates what that grant's going to do. And so if you're working along, if you're kind of doing your experiments alongside your writing, you can still identify, whether it's a certain protein, or you're using a certain mouse model, or you're using a certain technology, or whatever those factors are. You can usually take those factors and work them into something that's a manageable title. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Would you I know I'm putting you on the spot, but would you possibly be able to give me some examples of things you might have seen in the past that were effective?
In terms of just titles, or
Like a grant title, a title for a grant proposal.
off the top of my head, I don't have anything specific, but what we see in grant titles are typically, it's going to be a title that speaks to the kind of the question that they're asking through their research. And so it might be, RNA sequencing for identifying potential targets in colorectal cancer or something. And that's just, completely off the top of my head, I don't even know if that's a thing, but RNA sequencing, potential therapeutic targets, colorectal cancer, those are all things that if you're a reviewer of a grant, you're going to know kind of what to expect in that grant, what their kind of overall picture is. And you can take that kind of advice to writing a title for an article as well.
And you can email the
Thank you.
editors. Yeah, you can email the editors if you want sort of to talk to someone about it, or just get some feedback on a title.
Absolutely. Okay, so a few takeaways here. As we kind of mentioned at the beginning of this, a good title should spark interest for your audience. In other words, it should make your audience, the people that you want to read your research, and that's going to vary from person to person, but it should get those people to want to read your article. That's a good title. Be sure to read those journal instructions, because every journal is unique, every journal is different, and I'm not entirely sure the machinations here, but some, I think, if the title's too long, they reject it. It's like an administrative refusal. I don't know what it's called, but kind of flaunting a journal's instructions when you're submitting to the journal is just kind of poor form anyway. So be sure you look at those instructions and make sure your title adheres to it before you submit the manuscript to that journal. Also, a good title can increase citation counts and altmetric scores. And I think, Larissa, is this something you can talk a bit about?
Yeah. Well, the evidence is never 100% clear on citation counts, but having a good title, we know that it can increase the readership of your article. So altmetric scores are like who's reading it online, who's tweeting it, who's putting it on Facebook, on Wikipedia, wherever. So those things can increase your citation counts. I actually saw something this past week about getting cited on Wikipedia increases your citation counts, which makes sense. A lot of people are reading it. So it's just another thing to consider.
Our colleague Amy Nanetto posted in the chat, a good place to look at titles of successful grants is the NIH Reporter. It's a database of funded grants. So if you're looking for kind of what a title for a grant proposal looks like for the NIH, that's a great place to look. So that's good. And that's, in general, that's a great source to see kind of, trends in what's being funded and kind of like levels of detail that are expected and all that other fun stuff. Completely different conversation. Okay, so we do have some opportunities for additional information here. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is called The Right Stuff. You can go there to stay up to date for the latest news on things like grants, writing and publishing, and tips and tricks and so forth. And that's at our LibWizard site, right there in the that URL. And Larissa also posted the link in the chat box. Okay, and finally, of course, happy to entertain any other questions about titles or really otherwise. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. Larissa, did you have anything else that you want to add?
Just reach out if you have questions. I think just to reiterate, thanks, Amy, for putting that in the chat. One of the things I always do when I'm writing, not that I publish as much as you guys, but when I have, is to look at the journal I'm submitting to, check out what those article titles look like or articles look like in general, and get some ideas from that. But you know, the scientific editors are here for you, and the services are free for you to use. So please reach out and ask for help. Yeah. And the library is here for you too. So any questions? We're going to hang out for just a couple minutes in case anyone has additional questions. But if not, thank you so much, Joe, for presenting. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your week. And write some amazing article titles. Maybe you could have like a funny one to start with.
There you go.
An alternative one for you and your colleagues.
It might call it just a in lab working title or something like that.
I did think cleanup on aisle 6 was pretty perfect, though. You know, somebody got that down and was like, we have to do this. I don't care what we publish, but we're using this.
Yeah, unless you always read that as interleukin 6 and then it's just completely lost on you.
Yeah, I think when the person I saw post it said, someone in the comments was like, it took me a second to figure out what this was. So, which I guess is the reason why funny titles aren't always funny.
Yeah, well, and CRISPR bacon. I mean,
CRISPR bacon was good. Oh man, we like good puns. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. I think we're good. And I will send out slides and a handout to everyone afterwards. I'm going to include your link, Amy, to the handout.
cool. Thanks, Larissa.
Thanks, Joe. Have a good one.